Caleb Hunter walked into class thinking it was just another Monday, until his teacher laughed and said, "Guess you know all about buses, don't you?" The room roared, but the sting wasn't about the joke. It was about who she thought he was allowed to be. By the end of the week, that same teacher would be fighting for her job, and Caleb would be holding the evidence that could end her career forever. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The rain wasn't a drizzle. It was the kind that poured hard enough to blur everything in the distance, turning the world into a smudged watercolor. The bus windshield wipers groaned with each sweep, a tired rhythm that matched the knot tightening in Caleb Hunter's stomach. He sat in the very front seat, backpack balanced on his knees, staring at the reflections of traffic lights sliding over the wet pavement. His father, Derek Hunter, kept his eyes fixed on the road, one hand gripping the wheel, the other occasionally tapping the worn dashboard in time with the old R&B station on low volume. "Big day," Derek said after a stretch of silence, voice steady but edged with something else, pride mixed with worry. "You ready?" Caleb nodded without looking up. "Yeah." But the word felt thin, like paper in the rain. The yellow bus rumbled past familiar neighborhoods, and into streets lined with houses that looked like they belonged in glossy magazines. Pillared porches, manicured lawns, security gates. The closer they got to Riverview Preparatory School, the more out of place the bus seemed. Here, kids didn't ride public yellow buses. They arrived in glossy SUVs, or cars that hummed instead of roared. When the towering brick facade of Riverview finally came into view, Caleb's breath caught. It was intimidating in the way old buildings can be. Beautiful, but aware of its own history, aware of who had walked its halls and who hadn't. The bus stopped at the front steps. Derek leaned slightly toward his son. "Show them why you belong here." "You earned it, Caleb." Caleb swallowed, forcing a smile before stepping off the bus into the chill drizzle. The moment his sneakers hit the stone steps, the difference between him and the others hit harder than the rain. Students in sharp blazers huddled in clusters, laughing, holding coffee cups from artisanal shops. His own jacket, clean, but frayed at the cuffs, felt suddenly heavier. Inside the main hall, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume. Riverview's emblem, a golden lion's head, was engraved into the marble floor, daring anyone who stepped on it to prove they belonged. Caleb clutched his schedule, scanning the room numbers until he found Advanced History, room 214. His footsteps echoed against the hallway walls. Every few steps, his eyes caught quick glances from other students, some curious, some indifferent, some already calculating where to place him on Riverview's invisible social ladder. Room 2014's door was open. Mrs. Evelyn Cross was already there, arranging papers on her desk. She looked every bit the image of academic prestige. Tall, silver hair swept into a perfect bun, designer glasses perched on her nose, and a tailored charcoal dress that looked like it cost more than Caleb's father made in a month. Caleb slid into the last empty seat in the back row, his heart thudding as if the entire class could hear it. He unzipped his backpack slowly, trying to make no noise, trying to be invisible. But Mrs. Cross's gaze found him immediately. Her eyes swept over his rain-damp hair, his worn jacket, and the thin spiral notebook he'd pulled from his bag. "Well," she said, her voice clear and cool, carrying easily over the soft chatter in the room. "I guess you know all about buses, don't you, Caleb?" It took a second for the words to register. When they did, they landed like a slap. A few students chuckled, then more joined in, until the sound filled the space like static. Caleb's eyes flickered from face to face. Some were openly amused, others smirked quietly, and a few didn't laugh at all, but none stopped it. Heat crawled up his neck. He hadn't told anyone about his father's job. It meant Mrs. Cross had taken the time to learn it before class, maybe from staff, maybe from enrollment records, and decided it was worth sharing. He tried to force his gaze back to his notebook, but the laughter was still there, bouncing off the walls, pressing into his skin. Mrs. Cross smiled thinly, like someone who'd made a clever remark and didn't care if it cut. "Well, let's get started. Open your textbooks to page 12. The class shifted into the sound of rustling pages, but Caleb's pulse stayed loud in his ears. He could still feel the sting of her words, sharper because they weren't just about buses. They were about where she thought he belonged. He glanced out the rain-streaked window beside him. A droplet slid slowly down the glass, splitting into two smaller drops before disappearing. That's what it felt like, being split apart before you'd even had a chance to speak. The lesson began, but the words floated over him, meaningless. He caught phrases industrial revolution, social reform, but they barely registered. His eyes kept finding the clock at the front of the room. The second hand moved painfully slow. 45 seconds. A minute. Another minute. He thought of his father, who had been up since 4 a.m. to make the first bus route. He thought of the pride in his mother's voice when she told family Caleb had gotten into Riverview on merit. And he thought of how quickly Mrs. Cross had reduced all of it to a single cutting joke. He pressed the edge of his pencil into his notebook, leaving tiny dots in the paper. It was the only way to keep from shaking. As Mrs. Cross lectured, her tone remained smooth, unaffected, as though her earlier remark hadn't happened. But the damage had already been done. Caleb knew that in schools like this, the first impression could stick for years, and his first impression had just been delivered for him. His mind drifted to the hallway outside, to the gleaming school crest, to the way other students had looked at him when he walked in. He wondered how many of them would repeat her joke later, how many would build their image of him around it. The clock's hands inched forward. He thought about raising his hand, saying something, anything to shift the focus, but every possible response felt wrong. If he protested, he'd seem defensive. If he laughed along, he'd give them permission. And so he said nothing. Nothing felt heavy. The rain outside slowed, but the gray clouds pressed close to the windows, sealing the room in a kind of dim, cold light. Caleb stared at his notebook, realizing he hadn't written a single word of the lesson. When the clock finally crept toward the bottom of the hour, Mrs. Cross's eyes met his again. Not for long, but long enough for him to feel the weight of the unspoken message. This was her classroom. She set the tone, and he was already marked. He forced himself to look away, focusing on the hands of the clock, willing them to move faster. But when he glanced up, the minute hand had barely shifted. There were still 52 minutes left in this class. 52 minutes in which Mrs. Cross could choose to say something else. 52 minutes for the laughter to return. 52 minutes for Caleb to decide if this was just a bad start, or the beginning of something far worse. His pencil snapped in his hand, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and for a second, every head turned toward him. The pencil still lay broken on Caleb's desk, its jagged edge resting against the open notebook. No one said anything after the snap, but the eyes lingered on him for just long enough to let him know the moment was noted, filed away, ready to be pulled out later if needed. When the bell finally rang, Caleb kept his head down, shoving his things into his backpack with deliberate slowness. He waited until most of the class had left before standing. But Mrs. Cross's voice stopped him at the doorway. "Caleb?" Her tone was light, like a neighbor commenting on the weather. "Don't forget to read chapters 1 and 2 tonight. I wouldn't want you to fall behind." The pause before those last two words was so small, so precise that it almost felt accidental, but he caught it. He always caught it. The hallway outside buzzed with voices and the clatter of lockers. Caleb kept walking, weaving through groups of students who seemed to already have their people, their places, their rhythm. He didn't stop until he reached the far corner of the library, one of the few spaces that felt neutral, untouched by the social hierarchy of Riverview. That night's homework wasn't hard, but Caleb found himself rereading the same paragraphs over and over. His mind kept circling back to that single comment about the bus. Maybe it wasn't meant the way it sounded. Maybe he was being too sensitive. But the next morning erased any doubt. The rain had stopped, replaced by a crisp, cloudless sky. Caleb walked into history class to find Mrs. Cross already speaking with a few students near her desk. She looked up as he entered, then addressed the group in a voice loud enough for the whole room. "Well, now we can begin," she said, glancing at him. "Our resident traffic expert is here. I'm sure Caleb can tell us all about the best stop signs in town. He's got the front row seat to every one of them." This time, the laughter was immediate. Some students slapped their desks, others exchanged grins like they were in on a private joke. Caleb's chest tightened. His seat in the back felt even farther from the door than yesterday, as though the room had stretched to trap him. He tried to focus on the lesson, but Mrs. Cross didn't stop there. Anytime a historical figure's travels came up, she tossed in a remark. "Imagine that, Caleb. Some people traveled the world, not just the bus route." Or, "Caleb, you'd know all about being on the road every day." The class ate it up. Even those who didn't laugh outright started to smirk when she looked his way, like they were waiting for the next punchline. By the end of the period, he'd become part of the rhythm of her teaching, not as a student, but as a prop. Caleb stayed silent. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't trust his voice not to crack if he spoke. And each time he didn't respond, he could feel the assumptions settling around him like dust. Maybe he wasn't smart enough to fire back. Maybe he accepted it because it was true. The silence was becoming its own statement, just not the one he wanted to make. That evening at home, the kitchen smelled faintly of Angela's cornbread and the slow-cooked stew simmering on the stove. Derek sat at the table, still in his uniform shirt, scrolling through the local news on his phone. "How was day 2? Derek asked, glancing up. Caleb shrugged. "Fine." "Fine?" Derek gave a half-smile. "You're at one of the best schools in the state, kid. They feeding you all that knowledge or just the cafeteria mystery meat?" Angela chuckled softly as she set plates on the table, but her eyes flickered toward Caleb. She'd seen that shrug before, on her own face, years ago, when she'd been one of the few black students in her high school. Back then, the digs had come wrapped in jokes, too. Dinner went on with light conversation. Derek talking about a bus route detour, Angela mentioning a neighbor's new baby. Caleb ate quietly, nodding at the right times but not really joining in. Afterward, as Derek rinsed dishes, Angela leaned in the doorway, arms folded. "You notice how quiet he was?" "He's tired," Derek said. "New school, new routine. It's a lot." Angela didn't answer right away. Her gaze was still on Caleb, who was hunched over his homework at the kitchen table, pencil moving slowly. "It's not just that," she murmured. Derek looked over. "You think something's wrong?" "I think," she said, her voice low, "something's being done to him. And he's not ready to tell us." The next morning, Caleb walked into history class just hoping that maybe Mrs. Cross would let the joke die. But as soon as the lesson began, she turned to the board and said, "Now, some people make history, others just drive past it." The laughter was softer this time, almost hesitant. Caleb noticed a couple of students shifting in their seats. One girl in the front row frowned slightly, as if even she thought the comment was unnecessary. It was a flicker, a small, almost invisible crack in the wall of complicity. But before Caleb could process it, Mrs. Cross added something that had nothing to do with buses at all. Something sharper, something that made the room go quiet, even as she kept speaking. Her eyes locked on Caleb as she said it, and for the first time he realized this wasn't just about his father's job, it was about something much deeper. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of room 214, turning the wooden floors into streaks of gold. For once, Caleb thought maybe today would pass without a remark. He'd done his reading, he'd kept his head down, and Mrs. Cross had started the lesson without glancing his way. The class was deep into a unit on the civil rights movement, and Mrs. Cross's voice carried an almost performative gravity as she spoke about protests, marches, and leaders whose names were etched into history books. They fought against laws that told them where they could go, where they could sit, even where they could eat, she said, pacing slowly in front of the blackboard. They fought for the right to move freely in a world that wanted to confine them. Caleb's pencil moved steadily, his notes a neat row of facts and dates. For a moment, the history felt like a shield, objective, distant, safe. Then, without warning, Mrs. Cross stopped pacing. She turned toward the class, her eyes scanning the rows before landing squarely on him. "Some people," she said, her voice lighter now, "stay in their lane their whole life. Right, Caleb?" The words were soft, almost conversational, but they carried a weight that made the air shift. At first, Caleb didn't fully process it. Then the meaning sank in, layer by layer. Lane. Stay in your lane. A phrase that sounded harmless until you heard it in the wrong context, with the wrong history, from the wrong mouth. The classroom didn't erupt in laughter this time. A few students let out small, awkward chuckles, but most didn't laugh at all. Instead, they looked at each other, at their desks, anywhere but at him. A girl in the front row, blonde hair tucked behind her ears, glanced at Caleb and then quickly back to her book, her face unreadable. A boy near the window tapped his pen against his desk, the rhythm uneven, like he wasn't sure if he should react. Caleb's stomach tightened. This wasn't about buses anymore. It wasn't about stop signs or traffic routes. It was about who Mrs. Cross thought he was allowed to be, and who she thought he would never be. He lowered his eyes to his notes, but the words blurred. The history on the page, freedom rides, marches, speeches, suddenly felt too close, too personal.
Mrs. Cross moved on without missing a beat, launching into a discussion about sit-ins and court rulings. To anyone listening casually, it was just a lesson, but to Caleb, the sentence still echoed, its edges sharp.
The weight of the stairs pressed against him like invisible hands. He could feel people glancing at him when she mentioned restrictions or barriers, as if he were an exhibit instead of a classmate. The minute hand on the clock seemed stuck. He started counting the seconds in his head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, just to get through. When the bell finally rang, Caleb waited until the room emptied a little before standing. He didn't want to walk out in the middle of the pack, where whispers might follow him like shadows. He moved toward the door, keeping his gaze forward. But as he stepped into the hallway, 2 boys just ahead of him leaned toward each other. Their voices were low, but the words carried. "She's not wrong," one said. The other gave a short, sharp laugh. "Some people just know their place." Caleb kept walking, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists inside his sleeves. He didn't realize until he rounded the corner that he wasn't walking toward his next class. He was walking straight toward the exit. Caleb's sneakers slapped against the stone pathway as he moved away from Riverview's main doors. He hadn't planned to leave the building. It just happened. One turn down the hallway, instead of another, his feet steering him toward the cool air outside without asking his permission. The courtyard was mostly empty. A few students lingered under the shade of an old oak, scrolling their phones, their laughter light and easy. Caleb kept moving, passing the manicured hedges and the bronze lion statue that served as the school's mascot. His eyes stayed low, focused on the cracks in the walkway. He didn't want to think about the words he'd heard in the hallway. "She's not wrong. Know their place." But they kept pushing back into his mind, each repetition heavier than the last. He reached the bus lot, where the air smelled faintly of diesel and the low hum of engines filled the space. It was quiet compared to the chatter inside the school, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the kind of quiet that made you aware of every thought you were trying to avoid. Caleb sat on the curb, backpack still slung over one shoulder. He tugged the zipper open, pulled out his notebook, and flipped it to a blank page. His pencil hovered over the paper for a long moment, before he set it down again. What was he supposed to write? That his teacher had turned him into a running joke. That she'd taken a history lesson about equality and used it to reinforce the very thing it condemned. By the time the last bell rang, he still hadn't written a word. The bus ride home was short, but it felt longer than the morning trip. Derek sat behind the wheel, posture straight, eyes scanning the road. He'd been driving this route for years. He knew every stop, every pothole, every kid's name. When Caleb climbed aboard, Derek caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. His son's face was blank, unreadable. "You good?" Derek asked casually as they hit the first turn. "Yeah," Caleb replied too quickly. Derek knew that tone. He didn't push, not yet, but his hands tightened on the steering wheel. When they got home, Angela was in the kitchen, pulling a roasting pan from the oven. The smell of garlic and rosemary drifted through the air, warm and rich. She smiled when she saw Caleb, but her smile faded almost immediately. "You look tired," she said. "I'm fine," Caleb answered, setting his backpack down by the door. "Fine," Angela repeated slowly, as if testing the word. Derek came in behind him, hanging his keys on the hook. "That's the same thing he told me this morning. Same thing he told me yesterday, too." Angela's eyes narrowed slightly, not at Caleb, but at the way the words seemed to be building a wall between them. She set the pan on the counter and walked over. "Come here," she said. Caleb hesitated, but stepped closer. Angela looked him over the way. Only a mother could, searching, not just his face but the way he carried himself, the way his shoulders seemed to fold inward. "Something's going on." "It's nothing," Caleb said. Angela shook her head. "No, it's not nothing. I've seen this before. I've seen this exact look in the mirror, a long time ago." Caleb frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," she said quietly, "that when I was your age I learned real quick that racism doesn't always shout. Sometimes it dresses up like a joke. Sometimes it smiles when it stabs you." Derek, who had been leaning against the counter, straightened. "Angela, it's true," she said, looking between them. "My math teacher in high school used to tell me, don't bother with the hard problems, you're better with your hands than your head." Always with a little laugh, like it was harmless. And everyone else laughed too, but I heard what she was really saying. Caleb swallowed hard. "That's kind of what happened to me." Derek stepped forward. "Talk to us, son." Caleb stared at the floor. For a moment, the words caught in his throat, but then they came, halting at first, then spilling out faster. He told them about the first day, the bus comment, the laughter, He told them about the stop sign joke, the little digs that kept coming, and, finally, he told them about what happened during the civil rights discussion. She looked at me, Caleb said, voice shaking, and said, "Some people stay in their lane their whole life." Angela's breath caught, but she didn't interrupt. And after class, Caleb continued, "I heard these two guys talking. One of them said she's not wrong, that some people just know their place." The kitchen was silent. The only sound was the slow ticking of the clock above the fridge. Derek's expression hardened. This isn't just about her. This is about the whole system that lets her get away with it, about the way they teach us to accept it. Angela's hand found Caleb's. "You come from people who've been told their place for generations, Caleb, and every time, someone in our family decided not to stay there." Caleb met her eyes. "But what am I supposed to do? If I say something, they'll think I'm making it up, or they'll just laugh more."
"That's how they win," Derek said.
"By making you feel like speaking up isn't worth it." Angela leaned in. "You're not powerless, but you need to be smart. You need to understand exactly what you're up against before you move." Caleb felt something shift inside him, a small, sharp point of defiance pushing through the weight in his chest. Derek walked over to the counter, picked up his phone, and scrolled through his contacts. "I know someone who can help." "Who?" Caleb asked. Derek didn't answer right away. He found the number, pressed the call button, and put the phone to his ear. "Alden," Derek said when the line picked up. "Yeah, it's Derek Hunter. I've got a situation. My boy's got a teacher at Riverview who's decided she can cut him down without consequence. I think he needs to hear from you." There was a pause, and then Derek's voice softened. "Tomorrow? Good. We'll be there." He hung up and set the phone on the counter. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Who's Alden Price?" Derek gave a slow, almost secretive smile. "You'll see." Angela glanced at her husband, then at Caleb. "If your father's calling Alden, it means he's serious." Caleb frowned. "Serious how?" Derek met his gaze. "Serious about making sure you never believe the lie they're trying to sell you." Caleb didn't know it yet, but meeting Alden Price wouldn't just change how he saw Mrs. Cross. It would change how he saw himself. The next afternoon, Derek drove with a purpose. His hands gripped the steering wheel firmly, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Caleb sat in the passenger seat, backpack at his feet, watching the world outside the window shift from suburban streets to the quieter blocks of the old town. "You're not telling me where we're going," Caleb said finally. Derek's lips curved in the faintest smile. "Sometimes it's better if you walk in without expectations." They pulled into a small parking lot beside a red brick building with tall arched windows. Above the double doors, carved stone letters read, "Riverview Public Library. Us." Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of paper and polished wood. Sunlight streamed through stained glass panels high above, spilling patches of color onto the worn carpet. In the far corner beyond rows of history books and biographies, a tall man stood beside a table stacked with hard covers. He was lean, with silver hair cropped close to his head, a neatly trimmed beard, and sharp, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His dark brown skin was lined not with age alone, but with the weight of years spent watching and fighting. When he saw Derek, he smiled warmly. "Derek Hunter, been a long time." They shook hands, and Derek gestured toward Caleb. "This is my son, Caleb. He's the one I told you about." Mr. Alden Price extended his hand. "Pleasure to meet you, young man." Caleb shook it, feeling the man's grip firm, steady, but not overpowering. They sat at one of the reading tables, the afternoon light casting long shadows across the wood. Mr. Price leaned back in his chair, studying Caleb for a moment before speaking. "Your father tells me you've run into a teacher who likes to make you the punchline," he said. "That right?" Caleb hesitated, then nodded. "She jokes about my dad driving the bus, and other things." "Other things like what?"
Caleb's voice dropped.
"She said some people stay in their lane their whole life." Mr. Price's gaze didn't waver. "And you think she meant—" "I know what she meant," Caleb said quietly. Mr. Price nodded once, as if confirming something he already knew. "They can't define you, Caleb," he said, "but they'll try every day. The question is whether you let them." Caleb sat back. "What am I supposed to do? If I say something, it just gets worse." "That's because you're thinking about speaking as an act of reaction," Mr. Price said. "What I'm talking about is preparation. You can't win a battle you don't understand." For the next hour, Mr. Price spoke, and Caleb listened. He told him about coded racism, the kind that hides in polite tones. in harmless jokes, in rules that seem neutral but cut only one way. He explained how systemic bias worked like a network of invisible walls, always there, even if you couldn't see them at first glance. Sometimes the wall isn't in front of you, Mr. Price said. It's been built around you, and if you don't realize it's there, you'll mistake the space inside for freedom. Caleb felt each word settle in his mind like a piece clicking into place. He thought of Mrs. Cross's smirk, the laughter of the class, the way she had framed him before anyone knew his name. That's deliberate positioning, Mr. Price said when Caleb described it. She's shaping the way everyone sees you so you'll always be playing from behind. Caleb frowned. So what do? You learn, Mr. Price said simply. Knowledge is both armor and weapon. Armor so you don't absorb their lies. Weapon so you can dismantle them without them seeing it coming. They talked about historical figures who'd fought in ways that didn't involve shouting or fists. People who had turned the language of their oppressors back on them. They discussed why Bayard Rustin, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Polly Murray were often left out of school history books, and how that erasure was itself a form of control. People fear what they can't erase, Mr. Price said. Your teacher, she's trying to write you in the margins before your story even begins. Caleb sat forward, the stirrings of defiance from the night before now taking a sharper shape. So I have to write my own page. Mr. Price smiled faintly. Exactly. But here's the thing. Pages don't get read unless you know how to make people look. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the muted sounds of the library filling the space between them. Finally, Mr. Price leaned in. There will come a day, Caleb, when you have to decide whether to stay silent or speak, and that day will come sooner than you think. Caleb nodded slowly. And if I speak,
Then you make sure it's a voice they can't ignore.
Caleb didn't know it yet, but that day Mr. Price spoke of would arrive before the week was over, thrust upon him in a way he could never have predicted. The next morning, Caleb walked into history class with Mr. Price's words still echoing in his head. Pages don't get read unless you know how to make people look. Mrs. Cross stood at the front of the room, writing something across the board in neat, looping chalk letters. Semester project. Historical figures who challenged the norms of their time. When the class settled, she turned with a thin smile. For the remainder of the semester, you'll each research and present a historical figure who pushed against the boundaries of their society. Your task is to explain not only what they did, but why it mattered, and if it still matters today. Her eyes swept over the class, pausing for the briefest second on Caleb, before moving on. This is your chance, she continued, to explore people who were willing to take risks, make sacrifices, and challenge the way things were. Choose wisely. She began handing out assignment sheets. As she reached Caleb's desk, her gaze lingered a heartbeat too long. I expect something thoughtful from you, Caleb. He nodded without speaking, but inside a current of energy stirred. This was an opening, a chance to do exactly what Mr. Price had told him, to write his own page and make people look. When the bell rang, students clustered in small groups, tossing around names like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, Malcolm X. Caleb didn't join them. He already knew his choice. That afternoon, back at home, he spread his notes out on the dining table. Angela glanced at them as she passed with a basket of laundry. Who's that? Bayard Rustin, Caleb said. He organized the 1963 March on Washington, one of the biggest civil rights events in history, but they kept him out of the spotlight. Because he was gay, Angela said, her voice carrying the kind of knowing sadness that comes from understanding too well how people are erased. And because he was black, Caleb added. They didn't want him to be the face of the movement because they thought it would hurt the cause. So he did the work, but other people got the credit. Angela set the laundry down. You know, choosing him might make people uncomfortable. Caleb met her eyes. Good. The next day, when Mrs. Cross asked students to announce their topics, the room buzzed with safe, well-trodden names. Each announcement drew polite nods or murmurs of approval. Then it was Caleb's turn. He stood, his notes in hand, and spoke clearly. Bayard Rustin, civil rights strategist, chief organizer of the March on Washington. A man who changed history but was sidelined because of both his race and his sexuality. The room went quiet for a moment. Then Mrs. Cross's mouth curved, not into a smile but into something closer to a smirk. Interesting choice, she said, her tone smooth but edged. A complicated figure, to say the least. He challenged the norms of his time, Caleb replied evenly. Yes, she said slowly. Let's see if you can make that relevant. The words hung in the air, deliberate and heavy. For the rest of the period, Caleb's mind churned. He knew exactly what she meant. Let's see if you can make that relevant. Wasn't about history. It was about permission. It was about whether she thought someone like him was capable of making a case that mattered. But Mr. Price's voice was there too, cutting through her doubt. Knowledge is both armor and weapon. If Mrs. Cross wanted to see whether he could make Rustin relevant, Caleb would make him impossible to ignore. What Caleb didn't know was that Mrs. Cross had already decided his choice was a mistake, and she was about to start setting traps to prove it. By the next week, the air around Caleb at Riverview Prep had shifted. It didn't happen all at once. At first it was small things. Conversations that stopped when he approached, seats that used to be open now suddenly saved for someone else, study group texts he wasn't added to. Then the whispers began. He caught them in fragments between classes. He only got in because the school needed to fill their diversity quota. You know his dad drives the bus, right? That's the only reason they gave him a scholarship. Caleb kept walking, face neutral, but each word stuck like a burr under his skin. He knew Mrs. Cross hadn't said those exact lines out loud to the class, but he could feel her fingerprints on them. She didn't need to say it directly. She had planted enough seeds that others were now watering for her. In history class, the bias took a sharper, quieter form. When Caleb answered questions, Mrs. Cross would tilt her head, purse her lips, and say things like, "Well, that's one interpretation," before calling on someone else. Once, after he explained a historical court case in detail, she marked his participation as incomplete. When he asked why, she said, "It lacked objectivity." You're letting your personal feelings color the facts. It became a pattern. His participation grades slipped, even when he knew he had given strong answers. Mr. Price's advice echoed in his mind. You can't win a battle you don't understand. So Caleb started keeping a record. After each class, he jotted down what he'd said, how she'd responded, and any remarks that felt pointed. At first it felt strange, like building a case for a trial that might never happen. But with each entry, the pattern became clearer. One afternoon, he showed the notebook to Angela at the kitchen table. "This is good," she said, flipping through the pages. "Details matter. If they try to twist it later, you've got the truth right here." Derek leaned against the doorway, listening. "Don't just survive it," he said. "Make them regret underestimating you." But outside the walls of the Hunter home, the rumors kept spreading. A few kids who used to talk to him in the hall now walked past without a glance. His lab partner in biology asked the teacher for a switch, citing different learning styles. Even in the cafeteria, where he used to sit at the end of a crowded table, he now found himself alone. It wasn't loud, public exclusion. It was quiet, surgical, the kind you could almost pretend wasn't happening if you wanted to believe people were better than they were. Then came the turning point. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Caleb was in the library finishing some research on Baird Rustin. The light from the tall windows had gone golden, and most of the students had already headed home. His phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize. No text, just an image. Caleb tapped it open. The screenshot was from a group chat he'd never seen before. The chat name read, Riverview Real Talk. His stomach tightened as he scrolled. There were names he recognized, classmates, upperclassmen, even the son of one of the school board members. And then he saw it. A meme. His face photoshopped onto the front of a yellow school bus. With the caption, "The only thing he's driving is our diversity stats." Below it, in a different color text bubble, was a name he knew all too well, Evelyn Cross. Her message read, "Accurate," followed by a winking emoji. Caleb stared at the screen, the noise of the library fading into a hollow ringing in his ears. Mr. Price's voice came back to him again, this time like a warning. "Pages don't get read unless you make people look." Caleb's hands tightened around his phone as a thought formed. He had the proof, but using it could blow everything wide open. Caleb's thumb hovered over the screen, the meme glaring back at him under the fluorescent library lights. It wasn't just the image, it was the confirmation in Mrs. Cross's text. Accurate. The winking emoji made it worse. Mockery disguised as playfulness, cruelty wearing a smirk. His first instinct was to walk straight to the principal's office, drop his phone on the desk, and let the screenshot speak for itself. But as quickly as the thought came, another followed. What happens after? The chat had names, students with connections, families with influence. And Mrs. Cross, she wasn't just any teacher. She was well respected, decorated with awards, the kind of educator parents donated money to keep on staff. Caleb closed the phone and slid it into his pocket. His chest was tight as he left the library, the sound of his footsteps loud in the empty hallway. At home that evening, the kitchen light cast a warm glow over the table, where Angela was slicing vegetables for dinner. Derek sat across from her, flipping through a newspaper but clearly only half reading. Caleb dropped his backpack onto the floor and pulled out his phone. "I need to show you something." Angela wiped her hands on a towel and came closer. Derek set the paper aside. Caleb opened the screenshot. Angela's face hardened immediately. "She wrote this?" "Yes." His voice was low but steady. "And it's in a group chat with other students. Look at the names." Derek leaned in, scanning the screen. His jaw tensed. "This isn't just about you. This is her telling everyone else how to treat you." Angela looked up sharply. "You have to take this to the principal." Caleb hesitated. "If I do, she'll know it was me. And she has friends. Students, parents, staff. What if it makes things worse?" Angela's tone was firm. "Silence is consent, Caleb. If you let this slide, you're telling her she can do it again, and again to you or someone else." Derek rubbed a hand over his face. "And if you speak up, the school might circle the wagons to protect her. You've seen how they work. They'll twist it, say it was just a joke, that you took it wrong, and once they do, it's in your record. Colleges see that." Caleb looked between them, his pulse quickening. "So I'm supposed to just let it go?" Angela's eyes locked on his. "No. You're supposed to think carefully about how you move. If you're going to make a stand, do it in a way they can't use against you." After dinner, Caleb sat in his room, the glow from his desk lamp spilling over his notebook. He flipped past pages of project notes until he found the section where he'd been documenting Mrs. Cross's comments. The entries stretched back weeks now, each one like a brick in a wall. He was building, not to trap himself but to fortify his case. He thought about Mr. Price's advice. Knowledge is both armor and weapon. If he took the screenshot to the principal now, he'd be going into battle with one bullet. But what if he waited, collected more, built something undeniable? The risk was obvious. The longer he waited, the more chances she had to hurt him. But so was the potential reward. If he struck at the right moment, there would be no recovering for her. Caleb exhaled slowly. He knew what he had to do. He wouldn't run to the principal, not yet. He would confront the situation, but in his own way. The next morning, as he walked into history class, he felt a different kind of focus. Mrs. Cross gave him the usual glance, one part evaluation, and one part dismissal. He gave her nothing in return. Not his discomfort, not his irritation. She wanted to define him in the eyes of the class. He would define himself instead. When she called on him for a discussion question, he delivered his answer with precision, weaving in research so detailed it left no room for her usual incomplete or too emotional criticisms. The silence afterward wasn't awkward. It was respect, even if no one said it out loud. But Caleb noticed something else. When she turned to mark her gradebook, her expression was tight, calculated. It was later that day, while passing the open office door of Mrs. Langford, the guidance counselor, that he overheard it. "We'll need to finalize the scholarship review panel by next week," Mrs. Langford was saying. Caleb froze in the hallway. A second voice, unmistakably Mrs. Cross's, replied, "I'll be there. We can't just hand out scholarships to anyone without making sure they're the right fit." Caleb's stomach dropped. His future wasn't just in the school's hands. It was in her hands. And now, the game had changed entirely. Caleb woke before his alarm, the gray light of early morning seeping through the blinds. His mind was already awake, running through the lines he'd practiced the night before. The notes lay neatly in a folder on his desk. But those weren't what gave him confidence. The real preparation had been happening for weeks. In every conversation with Mr. Price, every moment of silent restraint in Mrs. Cross's class, and every carefully chosen entry in his notebook. This was not just another assignment. This was his moment to reclaim the narrative she had been writing for him since his first day. He dressed with precision, choosing a crisp shirt and the one good pair of slacks he reserved for special occasions. As he buttoned his collar, he glanced in the mirror and saw not just a student, but someone stepping into a role. He knew the risk. If this failed, it would only feed her campaign against him. But if it worked, she would never be able to frame him the same way again. At school, the hallways buzzed with the casual chaos of presentation day. Students clutched note cards, murmuring rehearsals under their breath. trading nervous jokes about who would go first. Caleb kept his pace steady, his expression unreadable. His focus was razor sharp. When he reached room 214, he paused at the door for a breath, the low murmur of voices spilling into the hall. Inside, Mrs. Cross was at her desk, arranging papers into a neat stack. Her clipboard rested on top, and she tapped the pen against it with a rhythm that felt intentional. She glanced up as Caleb entered, her gaze sweeping over him without expression. Before she addressed the room, "We'll go in alphabetical order today," she said, scanning the list. "Hunter, you're up first. No warm-up, no easing into it. Straight to the front." Caleb rose, his folder in hand, and walked down the narrow aisle between desks. The room seemed quieter with each step, the shuffle of papers and whispers dying down. He reached the podium and set his folder on it, but kept his hands on the edges, grounding himself. He began calmly, outlining Bayard Rustin's early life and his activism. He spoke of Rustin's work with A. Philip Randolph, his role in organizing the March on Washington, the logistical genius that made one of the most pivotal civil rights events possible. His voice was steady, his delivery controlled. Then, almost imperceptibly, he shifted. "Bayard Rustin," he said, "was a man who changed history without ever being allowed to stand fully in its spotlight. His absence from many textbooks is not an accident. It is the result of choices, deliberate choices, made by people who valued the cause, but not the man, because of who he was." He glanced up, sweeping the room with his gaze. A few students leaned forward. They said he was too controversial, that his personal life would be a distraction, that his voice, while powerful, should not be the one people heard. They told him, sometimes directly, sometimes wrapped in polite language, that he should stay in his lane. The phrase hung in the air, like a bell tone. He didn't need to explain why it resonated so sharply with him. Some of them remembered hearing it. A few glanced toward Mrs. Cross, quick and uncertain, before looking away. Coded language is one of the most effective tools of exclusion, Caleb continued, his tone sharpening slightly. It does not shout. It suggests, it tells people they're too emotional, too inexperienced, too unpolished. It tells them they belong in certain spaces, and not in others, and when those messages are repeated enough, people start to believe them. The room was still. Even the usual note-takers had paused, their pens hovering above the page. Caleb let the silence stretch just enough to make the point settle before moving on. But Rustin didn't disappear. He kept working, kept shaping the movement, even when his name was kept small in the footnotes. He understood that visibility wasn't the only form of power, and sometimes the most effective change comes from outmaneuvering those who underestimate you. Every sentence was deliberate. He was telling Rustin's story, but every word was also telling his own. He spoke about the strategic patience required to fight systemic bias, about the danger of letting others define your value, and about the moral courage it takes to stand in truth, even when silence would be safer. His conclusion was both an ending and a challenge. The question isn't just whether we remember Bayard Rustin. The question is whether we're willing to see the forces that kept him in the shadows, forces that are still at work, in classrooms, in boardrooms, in every space where people decide who is allowed to matter. He closed his folder and stepped back from the podium. History isn't just about what happened. It's about who gets to be seen. The silence that followed was different from the usual stillness before a bell. It was heavy with thought, with the unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted. Caleb could feel it. In the second row, a boy who had once laughed the loudest at Mrs. Cross's jokes now stared at his desk, his jaw tight. The blonde girl in the front leaned slightly forward, her eyes fixed on Caleb, as if replaying the last few minutes in her mind. Even the students who avoided him in the halls seemed, for once, unsure of the roles they'd been playing. Mrs. Cross finally spoke, her voice level but without its usual sharpness. "Thank you, Caleb." There was no comment on his delivery, no critique of content, no subtle undermining, just those 3 words. Then, with a pause that felt calculated, she added, "See me after class." Caleb returned to his seat, his heartbeat steady but strong. He didn't know what she was going to say, but he knew this much. She had heard him, and whether she admitted it or not, she had recognized herself in the mirror he had just held up to the room. The bell would release the rest of the class, but for Caleb, the real test was only minutes away. Behind a closed door, with Mrs. Cross deciding whether to retaliate or retreat. The bell's shrill ring cut through the quiet like a blade, and the class dissolved into the scrape of chair legs and the thud of backpacks. Caleb didn't move. He kept his hands flat on the desktop and watched the room empty in slow motion, eyes flicking past the students who avoided looking at him and those who looked too long. Miss Cross stood by the door, a sentinel with a clipboard, telling students to have a good rest of the day with the bright cadence she reserved for parents' ears. When the last of them drifted into the corridor, she closed the door with a soft click that sounded heavier than it was. "Bring your notes," she said, not turning around. "My office." Caleb gathered the folder, feeling the quiet press in. He wasn't scared now. Fear had burned itself out during the presentation, replaced by that focused calm that arrived when the only way out was through. He followed her down the short corridor to the cramped administrative pod behind room 2. Her office was smaller than he imagined, packed tight with framed certificates and tidy stacks of journals, a plant on the windowsill reaching toward a patch of pale light. She sat. He didn't. He waited. It wasn't defiance. It was insistence on clarity. She gestured to the chair anyway, the practiced smile reappearing like a reflex. "Sit, Caleb." He lowered himself, setting the folder on his lap, spine straight. The smell of lemon cleaner was sharp, and a wall clock ticked with the kind of precision that made time feel deliberate and watchful. "You did a provocative presentation," she began, fingers lacing together on the desk. "Polished, confident, certainly ambitious." "Thank you," he said. She tilted her head. Provocative can be a compliment, in moderation, but it can also cross into something less productive, borderline disrespectful. He kept his face calm. "Disrespectful to whom?" "To the standards of the assignment," she replied smoothly. "To the idea that a classroom is a place for objective inquiry, not grievances." He let the word sit there. Grievances. He pictured it printed on a form, filed and ignored. "I presented history," he said, "and the consequences of who gets written out of it." "You presented interpretation," she corrected, voice warm, almost indulgent. "Passionate interpretation. A good historian learns to temper that." "You asked us to choose a figure who challenged the norms and to explain why it mattered," he said. "Bayard Rustin's erasure matters." "It matters," she agreed quickly, as if soothing a child, "but there is a line between drawing parallels and insinuation. You walked right up to it. Some might say you stepped over." She tapped the desk lightly, a metronome of control. Intent matters less than effect. He recognized the shift. She was building a scaffold made of civility. Polite planks, careful nails, intended to present her corrections as mentorship rather than containment. "What effect do you mean?" he asked. "You risk distracting from scholarship by making students feel accused," she said. "There were faces in that room that closed off as you spoke. Learning doesn't happen when people feel attacked." He thought of the face that had closed first, the one sitting in front of him now. "I named no one," he said. "I described the language and mechanisms that kept Bayard Rustin out of the spotlight. And yet," she said, unblinking, "you selected phrases in a way that invited inference. That is a sophisticated move, and I respect the intellect behind it. But it's also an immature one, in a community setting, especially for someone with your profile." He felt the weight she tucked inside that last word. Profile. The polite synonym for place. "My profile," he repeated neutrally. She exhaled gently, as if sympathetic. "You're new. You're on scholarship. Students talk. You know how first impressions harden. A truly strategic student protects his opportunities instead of risking them on statements." He let a quiet pass. He could feel the room's arrangement. A desk between them, frames on the wall behind her like a jury, the plant straining after light, as if it knew what it meant to grow in limited space. "May I ask a direct question?" he said. "Of course," she said, sounding pleased to play fair. "Are you calling my work disrespectful because it's wrong?" he said. "Or because it's unflattering?" Something flickered in her eyes, then smoothed away. "I am saying that your approach undermines your goal. You want a high grade. You want a strong teacher recommendation. You want, if the rumors are true, the scholarship review panel to see you at your best. I sit on that panel, as you might know, and I admire potential when I see it." She folded her hands, smile tightening. "Potential can be coached." There it was, the velvet glove turned slightly, just enough to show the bone underneath. "What does coached mean here?" he asked. "It means a small adjustment," she said. 2 or 3 sentences in your conclusion reframed for academic distance. Perhaps trimming the section about forces in classrooms, since it ventured from history into insinuation. And if you submit that revision along with your written report, I think you'll find that your grade and your broader standing will reflect your judgment. He thought of the screenshot in his phone, the chat where his face had been pasted on a bus like a sticker, captioned as a statistic. He thought of her winking response. Accurate. The word had been so simple it felt antiseptic. By broader standing, he said quietly. You mean the scholarship. She spread her hands as if helpless before a process too large for either of them.
I mean, everything that follows you.
Paper trails, files, patterns. We all accumulate them. He could tell she wanted him to see this as realism, even kindness, the elder guiding the eager. Yet the shape of what she offered was clear. Make yourself smaller, and I will smooth your file. Keep your page neat, and I will turn it for you. You marked my participation incomplete last week, he said, keeping his tone even, after I summarized Shelley versus Kramer. I recall that, she said, head tilted. Your tone was strident. The content was not fully balanced. I quoted the holding, he said, and delivered it as if it were an indictment rather than a fact. She replied gently, returning the ball with the flick of a wrist. Delivery matters. A silence opened. The wall clock ticked as if tallying each word. He placed his folder on the desk, sliding a page from its pocket. Dates, remarks, the phrases she favored. Incomplete, overly emotional, for your own good. Documentation sat between them, like a mirror. I've been keeping notes, he said, so I can improve. Good, she answered without looking down. Mature. Awareness is the first step. He could see she would not glance at the paper. To do so would concede the existence of a pattern. It was the neatness of her technique that struck him. Never the blow that bruised, always the nudge that placed. You said some faces closed off, he said. Maybe some opened. She smiled again, the professional version honed by years of conferences and donor breakfasts. Perhaps. But those who matter, those who evaluate, are calibrated to rigor. They prefer restraint. They prefer comfort, he said, before he could stop himself, though his voice stayed soft. Her smile cooled. They prefer professionalism. He let her have the word. He tried imagining a model of professionalism that left Bayard Rustin tidy and untroubling, and felt for the first time that week a sharp pulse of anger under the calm. It wasn't the kind of anger that splashed. It condensed, dense as a stone. When you say 2 or 3 sentences, he said, you mean the spine. She gave a small performative laugh. Don't be dramatic, Caleb. You're bright. That brightness will take you far, as long as you learn which lights are heat and which are glare. I'm offering to help you with that. By cooling the parts that warm the room, he said. By ensuring you don't set fires you can't put out, she replied, leaning forward slightly. You are not just a person, Caleb. You are a file. Files go to committees. Committees prefer things that don't demand interpretation. If you present the right version of yourself, doors open. It's how this place works. For a moment he heard Mr. Price's voice. Sometimes the wall isn't in front of you. It's around you, and you'll mistake that space for freedom. Do you say that to everyone? He asked. Or just to people with my profile? She held his gaze, unflinching. I say it to students who impress me and who are at risk of wasting it. At risk because they tell the truth? At risk because they don't know when to stop. She nodded toward the folder. Tidy it. You'll thank me. His phone lay face down in his pocket. A small, warm weight. He felt the screenshot's existence like a current, and with it the choice branching in 2 directions. Reveal it now and force a rupture, or hold it and build something harder to dismiss. He had promised himself restraint in public. This office wasn't public, but it was a stage she had designed, with lighting angled to flatter her. He asked quietly, what happens if I don't change a word? Then she said, soft as snow, you'll learn about consequences that are no one's fault, and everyone's. A slightly lower grade on grounds of academic tone. A committee reading that finds you brilliant but in progress. A recommendation that praises your potential while advising patience. A scholarship panel that wonders if you fit what we intend to cultivate. Nothing personal, nothing explicit. Files are polite. She had said we. She had said it without apology, certain the institution would envelop her meaning and deliver it as policy. He glanced at the plant on the sill, its leaves green and tender, the soil crusted at the top from careful rationing. It looked healthy, if you didn't know what shape it might take given space. You said my presentation was ambitious, he murmured. It was, she she answered, bright again. Ambition is good. Aim it well. He nodded, almost as if agreeing. Then he lifted his folder and took out a single printed page, his bibliography, and placed it on the desk, turning it so the citations faced her. It was an ordinary move, so ordinary it disguised the decision dawning in him. I'll add a note clarifying the contemporary relevance, he said, and watched her eyes warm at the word add. And I'll include the primary sources you like. Good, she said, relief blooming in her voice as if she'd landed a skittish plane. Good. That shows maturity. He let the relief build in her a second longer, then asked casual as a remark about whether, will the scholarship panel also see my participation notes? It might help to contextualize the grading variant. There it was, the brief, unguarded flicker. She recovered quickly, but he'd seen it, the calculation recalibrating, the margin tightening. The panel sees grades and recommendations, she said evenly. Notes are for feedback between teacher and student. They don't travel. They should, he said gently. Context prevents misinterpretation. Misinterpretation is precisely what I am saving you from, she replied, and for the first time a slim strand of impatience entered her tone. You are young. You have time to learn proportion. I am offering you a way to be heard without harming yourself. You're offering me a way to be palatable, he said, to be the version of me that doesn't trouble the files. She didn't deny it. She sat back, folded her hands again, smiled in a way that said the meeting was over, the lesson complete. Take the night. Send me your revision by morning. I'll reconsider your grade, and I'll remember your judgment when I sit with the panel. That's fair. He stood, not abruptly, deliberately. He slid the folder back under his arm and felt his heartbeat steady to the tick of the clock. Thank you for the feedback, he said.
You're welcome,
She answered, warmth restored like a lamp clicked on. You're a talented young man, Caleb. Don't sabotage it by chasing heat. He turned to go, hand closing on the doorknob. Then he stopped. Mr. Price's words arrived not as counsel this time, but as permission. There will come a day when you decide whether to stay silent or speak. It will come sooner than you think. He looked back at her. She waited, patient, confident he'd accepted the lesson. Everything in the room was designed to persuade him to leave pliant and grateful. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dramatize. He simply placed the sentence in the air between them, unadorned and undeniable, each word a bead on a string that could not be cut. I'm not revising truth to fit your file. The plant's leaves trembled in the thin heat from the radiator. The clock ticked once, twice. He watched the smile on her face hold, then falter by a degree so fine it could be missed by anyone who wasn't looking directly at it. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. That's unwise, she said softly. Careful now, as if the room had grown microphones. He nodded once. I know. Think carefully, she pressed, finding her footing, about what you're risking. I have, he said. Have you? Silence stretched, then thinned, then snapped. She reached for her pen with brisk economy, as though the act of writing could restore the order of things. You should go. He turned the knob and pulled the door open. The corridor outside lay empty, the school's late afternoon hush pooling against the baseboards. He stepped out, then paused, half in light, half in shadow. He didn't plan the next sentence. It arrived with the certainty of a key sliding into the right lock. I know about the group chat, he said without turning. And your comment. Behind him, the pen stopped moving. What comment? She asked, the question shaped with the kind of care meant for witnesses and records. The one you labeled accurate, he said. You winked, in case the point was too subtle. A breath caught hers, not his. He could feel the shape of the office shifting behind him, as her frames and certificates watched the exchange. You should be careful about false accusations, she said, much calmer than the pulse rising under her voice. Such claims can ruin lives. He stepped into the hallway and let the door begin to swing. Then he pressed 2 fingertips to the wood and held it there, his voice still low, steady, precise. They only ruin them when they're false, he said. See you in class. He released the door and started down the corridor, heartbeat no longer pacing the clock, but outstripping it, each stride lighter than the last, and heavier too, because now the path had direction and cost. He hadn't made it 10 paces when his phone buzzed. An email notification from the school office, subject line, meeting request, academic conduct and scholarship review. Tomorrow 8. The subject line stared at him all night. Meeting request, academic conduct and scholarship review. Tomorrow 8. Caleb lay awake watching the ceiling collect the thin blue of early morning. The words ticking across his thoughts like a second clock. He'd told his parents after dinner. Angela had gone still in that particular way that meant resolve, and Derek had nodded once, as if a long-expected train had finally ground into view. No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. The email had done the shouting for them. By sunrise, the story of his presentation was no longer a classroom rumor, but a shape moving through the school's bloodstream. Someone had shared a clip from a phone, just 30 seconds of Caleb at the podium saying, "History isn't just about what happened, it's about who gets to be seen." It jumped from phones to feeds, then into the orbit of parents who monitored those feeds with the vigilance of air traffic controllers. The caption was neutral, Riverview student presentation, but the comments weren't. Some were admiring, others were barbed. A few wrapped in courtesy hinted that he had made people uncomfortable, as if discomfort were an indictment rather than a beginning. By mid-morning, the student paper's editor posted a poll. Should history class confront current bias? The responses split like a river around a rock. That same hour, a local education blogger embedded the clip, calling it a rare moment of student clarity. The blogger tagged the school's account. 10 minutes later, the principal's inbox began to fill. Caleb felt the shift as a pressure in the hallways. Groups huddled longer than usual. Teachers lowered their voices when he passed, and the librarian, kind-eyed and even-handed, gave him a look that was almost apology. In history, Mrs. Cross was immaculate and unchanged, her lesson plan unfolding with the same chalked neatness. She did not look his way for most of the period, and when she did, her expression was the exact temperature of cordial. Nothing to see, her face said. Everything in order. At 10:42 a.m., the intercom pinged. "This is Principal Larrabee," came the measured voice, honed by decades of assemblies and donor events. "In light of growing tensions and community interest, we will host a listening session after school in the auditorium. Students, parents, and faculty are welcome. We expect respect, clarity, and care." Growing tensions, someone whispered behind Caleb, as if naming a weather system. The phrase was a velvet rope stretched across a doorway. You could enter, but only on the school's terms. After the bell, he texted Angela and Derek about the listening session. Angela wrote back, "We'll be there." Derek sent no text, just a photo. His bus parked, windows reflecting an auditorium entrance he'd probably driven past 1,000 times. Mr. Price called just before lunch. "You're walking into a room designed to keep things calm," he said, voice low, steady. "Calm is good for institutions, but truth sometimes arrives with an edge. Know where your edges are. Use them without cutting yourself." "What does that look like?" Caleb asked. "Answer the question you're asked," Mr. Price said. "Then answer the one beneath it. And remember, if a wall cracks, people will tell you to be quiet, so it doesn't collapse. That's when you ask who the wall was built to protect." The day stretched. He ate nothing. He tried to rehearse lines and gave up. The words felt dead when he practiced them. He didn't want polished. He wanted precise. At 3:30 p.m., the auditorium lights came up on a crowd that looked like Riverview's glossy brochure had been shaken until its images spilled out. Pressed blazers, silk scarves, soccer warm-ups, a row of staff in lanyards, donors clutching tote bags. On stage sat Principal Larrabee, 2 assistant principals, the guidance counselor, and at the end of the table, Mrs. Cross, posture perfect, hands lightly folded, the picture of responsible concern. Caleb slipped into a seat beside his parents halfway up the aisle. Angela reached for his hand and squeezed once. Derek's jaw was set, but his eyes were calm, clocking exits and entrances the way a driver reads a route. "Thank you for joining us," Principal Larrabee began, voice amplified and smooth. "We convened this listening session because we value our community's trust in our students' well-being. Recent events," he paused, letting the phrase work, "have prompted questions about classroom climate and our shared standards." He gestured to Mrs. Cross. "Mrs. Evelyn Cross is a veteran educator with a record of excellence. We want to address concerns without undermining our teachers' ability to teach or our students' ability to learn." Angela's fingers tightened around Caleb's for a second. He felt the message in the pressure. "Be ready. This is the frame." Mrs. Cross leaned toward the mic. "Thank you, Principal Larrabee. I am proud of my students. I have always encouraged rigorous inquiry. A recent presentation was provocative, and I commend the students' effort. I did, however, feel it edged into insinuation, and created a climate where some students felt accused. It's never my intent for anyone to feel targeted in my classroom. I've been unfairly characterized online, and I hope we can return to a place of objectivity. There it was, soft hands around a hard claim. Caleb recognized the same architecture as in her office. Reassurance wrapped around a narrowing. Larrabee nodded. We'll hear from students and parents. Please keep comments focused and brief. A hand went up instantly. A boy from the senior class, baseball jacket unzipped, the self-possession of someone whose family's name was on a plaque. I wasn't in the class, he said, but I saw the clip. It felt like politics in a history class. We're here to learn facts, not be made to feel guilty for stuff people did decades ago. Murmurs rippled. Agreement from one side, discomfort from another. Caleb watched Larrabee's satisfied blink. Balanced perspectives achieved. A girl from Caleb's class stood. The blonde from the front row. Sloane Whitaker, spine straight, voice clear. I was in the room, she said. The presentation was about Bayard Rustin and how systems erase people. It didn't name anyone. It asked us to think about the present without calling anyone a racist. It made me think harder. That's what school is for. A few claps quickly shushed. Mrs. Cross inclined her head, as if receiving a reasonable opinion she didn't share. Another hand. A father in a tailored suit. I respect Mrs. Cross, he said. I also think students on scholarship may feel pressure to perform in ways that impress the wrong audience. Social media. This could hurt our school's reputation. Caleb felt the word "our" like a well-polished door closing. A junior took the mic next, voice shaking. I'm Latina. Last year when I answered a question about immigration policy, I was told my response was too personal and got marked down. I didn't complain because it's Mrs. Cross. But I felt small for days. There was a hush brief, uncomfortable. The principal nodded, sympathetic and outbound already. Thank you for sharing your feelings, he said. The institutional bomb. A boy from the back row of Caleb's class stood up. Sometimes when Caleb talks, the room gets weird. That's not on him. It's because we're not used to hearing certain things. Maybe that's the problem. Heads turned. Mrs. Cross's smile thinned by a fraction. It is also my job, she said into the mic, to maintain an environment where learning can happen without anyone feeling singled out. Angela released Caleb's hand, only to raise her own. Larrabee squinted into the crowd, recognized an adult who was not a donor, and seemed to reconsider before nodding. Angela stood, voice steady, cadence precise. I'm Caleb's mother. Feeling singled out isn't the same as being singled out. My son has been the subject of in-class jokes about his father's job, our family's work. He has been graded down for being too emotional when he quoted case law. Objectivity can be a weapon when it means be less yourself, so I'm comfortable. The room tightened. Mrs. Cross leaned forward, her tone warm enough to fog a mirror. Mrs. Hunter, if any remark of mine was taken as a joke at your expense, I truly regret that misunderstanding. My students know I use humor to build rapport, never to wound. Derek stood next, voice even as a level. I drive the bus that brings these kids to school. I see them wave when they need the doors held. I treat them like they matter. That's all I expect in return. He sat. Caleb watched the lines of the room redraw themselves. The bus driver now a presence in the space, not just an anecdote. Some parents shifted. A few glanced at Mrs. Cross to see how she would metabolize that. A student journalist with a press badge half hidden under her hoodie stepped to the mic. Question for administration. If a teacher participates in student group chats that mock a student, does that violate policy? The auditorium tilted. Larrabee blinked. Mrs. Cross's hands did not move. We do not engage in hypotheticals involving private communications, the principal said carefully. We evaluate facts when they are brought to us. The journalist nodded once, as if she'd expected that answer and wanted it on record. Caleb felt his phone. The screenshot, like a coin in his pocket, that could buy entrance and start a fire. He didn't move. Not yet. A voice in him, Mr. Price's voice, reminded him, answer the question beneath the question. He raised his hand. The mic reached him via a passing line of students. He stood, heart steady now, words arrayed behind his teeth. I'm the student who presented, he said. I spoke about erasure. I didn't name anyone. I did talk about language that makes people smaller. After the presentation, I was invited to a meeting about academic conduct. I was also told that small edits would help my grade, and my scholarship prospects. When a file matters more than a student, we stop learning and start managing. A low stir, a sound between surprise and recognition, moved through the seats. Larrabee leaned to the microphone, ready to reposition the frame. Caleb, thank you. We will always protect both rigor and fairness. Our scholarship review is independent. Excuse me, a voice cut in from the audience, clear, composed, amplified by nothing but conviction. A hand rose. A woman in a dark blazer stood from the front section reserved for parents, her posture that of someone accustomed to boardrooms and city hearings. Caleb recognized her from the donor wall. Eleanor Whitaker, Sloane's mother. Her face was unreadable, but he could feel the air recalibrate around her, money and influence warming to their task. Mrs. Cross's eyes flickered toward her with a barely visible relief, the kind reserved for allies arriving on time. I'm a parent, Miss Whitaker said, voice formal. I support our teachers. I also support our children when they tell us they're being diminished by the very rooms that promise them a future. This is not a trial, but we all know what patterns look like. She turned, seeking someone a row back. Lydia, she prompted softly. A woman in a floral blouse stood beside her, not wealthy, not board member polished, nervous, yes, but resolved. She gripped the back of the seat in front of her to steady her voice. My daughter is a sophomore, she said. She's quiet. She came home crying 2 months ago because she was told her answers were too anecdotal and that some people should stick to what they know. She thought it was her fault for talking about her neighborhood. Her throat tightened. She swallowed and pressed on. She didn't want to speak, but she showed me her notes. The words lined up over weeks. The auditorium went very still. Patterns became sensation. Sensation became thought. Mrs. Cross leaned to the mic, composure absolute. Again, I regret any hurt feelings, but I urge us not to conflate isolated experiences with intent. The student journalist lifted her phone, recording. On stage, Principal Larrabee inhaled, ready to bring the curtain down with gratitude and next steps. But the room was no longer his to land cleanly. It had a pulse now, a syncopation he couldn't smooth. A hand rose from the far aisle. A man in a navy blazer with the school crest stood, his face pale with the purpose of a person who had argued with himself for hours and finally lost the argument with silence. He cleared his throat and looked straight at the stage. My daughter has something to tell you about Mrs. Cross, he said. She's ready to speak now. For a moment, no one moved. The man's words seemed to hang in the auditorium air, drawing all the oxygen toward them. My daughter has something to tell you about Mrs. Cross. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It carried the weight of a truth that had been held too long, one that could change the geometry of the room. Caleb turned toward the aisle. A girl stood slowly from the row beside the man. She was small, her dark hair pulled back in a low braid, and she clutched the straps of her backpack as if they could anchor her. Her eyes scanned the faces, parents, teachers, classmates before finding her father's. He gave her a single nod. She stepped into the aisle. Her voice trembled on the first syllable, but steadied as she went. Last semester, she began, I stayed after class to ask Mrs. Cross a question about my essay. She told me it was ambitious, but maybe I should focus on something closer to my own experience. The topic was women in the suffrage movement. I asked what she meant, and she said, well, the 1960s civil rights era might be more relatable for you. A low murmur rippled through the audience. The girl's eyes dropped to the floor. I didn't know how to answer. I just said okay. But I went home and deleted half my paper. I thought I'd done something wrong. She stepped back into her row, head low. Her father kept a hand on her shoulder, his gaze fixed on the stage. Principal Larrabee cleared his throat, clearly eager to move forward, but another hand shot up from the back rows. A tall boy in a Riverview basketball hoodie rose. When I was a freshman, we were doing a debate in history class. I was on the side arguing for the economic contributions of minority-owned businesses. Mrs. Cross told me my arguments were passionate, but that I should try to be more mainstream. I didn't know that was code for white, until later. He sat the girl next to him, who hadn't looked up the entire meeting, now raised her hand halfway. Larrabee hesitated before nodding to her. She spoke so quietly that people leaned forward to hear. I'm on the student council. Last year, Mrs. Cross asked me to help plan a Heritage Month event. When I suggested we highlight writers from the Harlem Renaissance, she said, let's not make it too niche. We want it to appeal to everyone. The girl looked directly at the stage. I didn't realize she meant don't make it too black until my mom explained it. Another murmur. The sound was growing, no longer a ripple but a low, building tide. From 2 rows in front of Caleb, a boy with sandy hair stood abruptly, hands shoved in his pockets. I'm not a scholarship student. My parents donate here, and I'm saying that because it matters in this story. Mrs. Cross treats me differently. I can give a half answer and she'll call it insightful. I've watched her cut off other students mid-sentence. Always the same ones. He looked over his shoulder toward Caleb. It's not in your head, man. We see it. Caleb met his eyes, but the boy sat before he could respond. More voices followed. A senior described being told that his writing was too urban for an academic competition. A junior recounted being paired with someone she'd be more comfortable with for a group project. Translation: another black student. Even the small stories, the seemingly offhand remarks, began to form a lattice of something undeniable. The auditorium's air shifted. At first there had been hesitation, people weighing the cost of speaking against the security of silence. But as each account landed, it made the next one easier, faster. One voice became 2, then 5, then a dozen. Not all were students. A parent in a floral scarf spoke up. My son came home saying he'd been marked down for making his essay too political. The essay was on redlining. How do you write about redlining without politics? An alumnus in the back raised his hand. I graduated 4 years ago. I thought maybe things had changed. Guess not. Mrs. Cross told me once, during a mock trial project, that I was better suited to the role of witness instead of lawyer because I had a very strong personality. He smiled without humor. We all know what that meant. The voices overlapped now. The auditorium was no longer under the stage's control. Every statement chipped away at the tidy picture Larrabee and Mrs. Cross had tried to maintain. The neat line between perception and reality was cracking under the weight of too many matching details. Mrs. Cross sat with her hands clasped in front of her, knuckles pale, the practiced warmth of her expression beginning to cool. She still nodded at intervals, the universal gesture of listening, but her eyes had that fixed sheen of someone concentrating on survival, not dialogue. Angela Hunter raised her hand again, her voice carrying with calm precision. I've been listening for over 20 minutes. These aren't isolated stories. This is a pattern, and the danger of a pattern is that people stop noticing it, even when they're in it. That's how bias works. It becomes the water you swim in. Caleb felt something stir in the room at that, like a current turning. Even Principal Larrabee, though he kept his expression neutral, had stopped glancing at the clock. The assistant principals exchanged quick looks, the sort that meant we're past the talking points now. And then, from the left aisle came a voice that surprised Caleb. Sloane Whitaker. She didn't stand right away. She just leaned toward the mic stand, brought to her row and spoke into it with deliberate clarity. I've been in Mrs. Cross's class for 2 years. I've learned a lot, but I've also watched moments that didn't sit right. Not everything is about grades or comments. Sometimes it's who she calls on, who she doesn't, who she jokes with, and who she jokes about. She paused, her gaze flicking briefly toward Caleb before returning to the stage. It's subtle, but subtle things add up. And now, hearing everyone else, I think we've all been adding without realizing it. The silence after her words was different, less shocked, more certain, like a balance had tipped. Larrabee straightened. His voice, when it came, was careful. We appreciate the honesty and courage shown today. It's clear there are concerns that require further review. Our priority is to ensure every student feels respected and supported. The superintendent, who had been sitting quietly off to the side until now, leaned toward his microphone. He was a large man with a deliberate presence, and when he spoke, his voice had the tone of an official statement that would be repeated later in print. In light of the accounts shared here today, he said, and the seriousness of the concerns raised, Mrs. Evelyn Cross will be placed on temporary administrative leave pending a full investigation. Gasps. A few claps, one sharp exhale from somewhere in the back. Mrs. Cross's eyes didn't widen, but Caleb noticed her left hand move slightly, almost instinctively, toward the papers in front of her, as if she might shield them. This is not a final judgment. The superintendent continued. It is a step toward transparency and fairness for all involved. We will communicate updates as the investigation proceeds. The auditorium shifted into a low hum of conversation. Some looked relieved. Others looked wary, even defensive. but no one could deny that something had cracked. The wall wasn't down, but it was no longer seamless. Caleb sat back, the tension in his shoulders loosening just enough for him to breathe deeply. Around him, students exchanged quick glances, some leaning closer to whisper, others just looking forward as if absorbing what had just happened. But even as the meeting began to wind down, Caleb's focus stayed on Mrs. Cross. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring straight ahead, her expression controlled, but there was something in her posture, something that didn't feel like defeat. Caleb felt it then, a quiet certainty beneath the noise of the room. This wasn't over. Whatever Mrs. Cross did next, it wouldn't be from the sidelines. The auditorium emptied in waves. First the students with their heads down, then the parents in tight clusters, then the staff gathered like geese preparing a formation. Caleb stayed seated until the buzz thinned. From the aisle, whispers grazed his name, without claiming it. Temporary leave, investigation. Out of proportion. He watched Mrs. Cross leave by the side door, spine straight, a small navy tote looped over her wrist. She did not look back. Outside, the air had cooled. A dusk wind rattled banners along the walkway. Excellence, integrity, community, the words snapping like flags at half-mast. Angela tucked her hand under Caleb's elbow. "We go home together," she said, as if he might be tugged backward by an invisible undertow. Derek walked on his other side, step steady, shoulders set to take whatever crosswind the night pushed at them. By the time they reached the car, the first messages had begun. His phone trembled in his pocket. 1, 2, 5 vibrations. In the rear view, Caleb could see the screen lighting his jeans like a small frantic lighthouse. He didn't look yet. He needed the quiet of seatbelts clicking, of the engine turning them into motion. He checked at the first red light. The top message was from a number he didn't know. "You really think you're a hero? You just ruined a good teacher's career." Another, "My kid loved Mrs. Cross. You made her afraid to teach." A third through a social app he barely used. "Quota boys should be grateful, not loud." The rest blurred into a single sour current. Anonymous accounts, blocked calls, an email with no subject line, and a one-sentence body. "Know your pl—" Angela glanced over. "How bad?" "Loud," he said, and practiced. He scrolled, seeing the same phrases repeat across platforms, as if someone had handed out a script. Overly sensitive, political, divisive. One message included a photo of his presentation clipped with a caption, "He thinks he's the main character." Derek kept his eyes on the road. "They always sound the same," he said quietly. "Different mouths, same mouthpiece." At home, the living room felt smaller, as if the messages had followed them inside like weather. Angela set tea on the coffee table and pulled out a legal pad. "We document," she said. "Every message, time-stamped. Handle. We don't answer. We don't delete. We keep." Caleb nodded and started forwarding screenshots to a folder labeled receipts. He added the group chat meme again, filing it now not as shock but as evidence in a ledger that was beginning to have weight. As he worked, more messages slid in. "You took away a mother's livelihood. If you can't handle jokes, don't go to Riverview. Enjoy your 15 minutes. He paused at one from a parent profile with a smiling family banner. "We've given so much to this school. You give nothing but trouble." It wasn't the threat that shook him. It was the certainty. The sentence carried the confidence of ownership. "People are posting in the parents group," Angela said, scanning her phone. It's split. Some are asking why a teacher is in student group chats. Others are furious anyone asked the question. Derek leaned forward, elbows on knees. "They'll come for your attitude, then your accuracy, then your motives," he said. "When those don't hold, they'll come for your tone. Don't give them yours to own." Caleb's phone rang. "Mr. Price." He swiped to answer. "I'm listening," he said, because he knew what call this was. "Good," Mr. Price replied, "because I'm not going to sweeten it. What you're feeling is the first gust. Change arrives like weather, and the first thing people build is a shelter called backlash. They will call it concern. They will call it standards. They will call it love. It is fear in a rented suit." "They're saying I ruined her life," Caleb said, voice level, almost curious at his own calm. "You interrupted her weather," Mr. Price said. "She will try to make that your fault. Others will help her, because your interruption made them suddenly wet. Hold your umbrella higher." Caleb exhaled a laugh that wasn't humor. Some of them know the exact scholarship amount I'm applying for, he said. They're posting it like I stole something. Silence breached, then Mr. Price's tone sharpened. And how would they know that? That's what I'm asking, Caleb said. That information is supposed to be private. Angela looked up, eyes narrowing, as Caleb repeated the detail aloud. Derek's jaw flexed once, a slow tightening. Then that is a leak, Mr. Price said. Leaks have sources. Sources have motives. Document where you saw it. Screenshot everything. Do not accuse. Build. Caleb scrolled, fingers steady now. The post was on a private parents forum, screenshot and re-uploaded by a student to another app. Why are we rewarding disruption with XX $1,000 a year? The numbers were exact down to the dollar. A string of comments followed with the same reheated language. Not a fit, too political, poor role model. Angela's pen pressed harder against the pad. Private committee numbers don't float, she murmured. They're carried. Caleb stared at the ceiling as if it might give him a name. He heard the scratch of Angela's pen, the measured sound anchoring him. He thought of Mrs. Cross's voice in her office. We all accumulate files. He thought of her unflinching, curated smile on stage. You don't have to fight every rumor, Mr. Price said. Decide which stones to step on. Let the water carry the rest out to sea. So which one first? Caleb asked. The one about who you are, Mr. Price said. Backlash tries to replace you with a character called Problem. Keep telling a truer story, quietly, repeatedly, and when you can, lift someone else's story too. The flood doesn't stop, but the current changes direction. After they hung up, Caleb opened his laptop and stared at a blank document. He typed 3 sentences he could stand on if asked for a statement. I spoke about history and the present because both matter to students like me. I'm grateful to those who spoke up about their experiences. I want a school where every student is seen without being made smaller. He didn't post it. Not yet. The timing would matter as much as the content. A ping, then another. The messages kept coming, shifting tone as the evening crowds rotated onto their phones. Some were clumsy rage. Others were sanded down to plausible concern. One read, "You embarrassed a great educator. Is that just another? If this is your activism, maybe don't do it on our dime." He could hear the dinner table behind those words, the fork set down, the righteousness rehearsed like grace. He clicked into his school email to check for updates and found a new message. Subject line, opportunity to tell your side local press. He didn't open it. Not yet. He pictured a microphone angled like a trap. He pictured saying one sentence wrong, and watching it get sliced into a thumbnail for strangers to fight over. Derek returned from the kitchen with 3 glasses of water, and set them down like a small ritual. Drink, he said, then sleep where you can. Sleep, Angela echoed, though the pen didn't stop. Backlash fattens on exhaustion. We don't feed it. They tried. The house dimmed. The messages didn't. Sometime after midnight, Caleb's phone lit again, this time with a new twist. A fake account using his profile picture posted a comment under the clip of his presentation. Teachers like her need to be taken down. He felt his stomach flip. The words were perfectly wrong. Aggressive, vindictive, designed to make him look like exactly what they were trying to name him. He reported the account, documented the post, and sent the link to himself into a separate folder. Impersonations. He added a note, timestamp, IP request. He didn't know how yet, but if the school wanted to know about conduct, here was conduct. Morning arrived with a pale, fatigued light. The school sent a general notice. We condemn harassment of any member of our community. It was symmetrical enough to be safe, wide enough to mean nothing in particular. The parents' forum sizzled through breakfast and mid-morning carpools. A petition appeared. Reinstate excellence. Bring back Mrs. Cross. Within an hour it had gathered a few hundred signatures, most anonymous, some loud. Then a second petition. Protect students, investigate patterns. Fewer signatures, names attached. Sloane's was the first. Underneath, a line from the student journalist. Sunlight is not slander. At lunch, a teacher Caleb barely knew passed him in the hall and said, low, almost furtive, you were brave. Another teacher within earshot smiled a tight neutral smile and said to no one, we must be careful not to criminalize rigor. Caleb didn't respond to either. He filed both in the ledger in his mind. By afternoon, a rumor staggered through the halls, like a drunk. Mrs. Cross had hired an attorney. Someone claimed she'd filed a grievance. Hostile work environment. Defamation. No one could prove it. Everyone passed it on like a torch, lighting certain corners on purpose. Caleb felt the heat, but didn't flinch. He added the rumor to his unverified list and kept walking. After school, he found the library's far corner and sat with his back to the stacks. Mr. Price texted, "Hold your center." Angela sent a photo of a pot on the stove, with the caption, "Home is hot, not the internet." Derek sent nothing. But a minute later, a bus horn sounded outside, a small private code, "I'm here." Caleb closed his eyes. He tried to hear the quiet beneath the noise and found, surprisingly, a thread of steadiness. It wasn't confidence, it was commitment. He had stepped into something he couldn't step out of without leaving himself behind. He recognized the cost, and strangely felt lighter for paying it. His phone chimed again. Another anonymous message, he assumed. He almost didn't look. Then he saw the sender, not a string of numbers or a parent forum handle, but a corporate email domain he recognized from the morning news that played in the cafeteria, from airport TVs, from tweets that bent the day. Subject line: interview request. National Morning Desk. He opened it. The body was brief and precise. "We're producing a segment on classroom climate and student voice. We saw the clip of your presentation and the subsequent community meeting. We'd like to hear your perspective. Are you available for a recorded interview tomorrow?" Caleb stared at the screen, pulse steady as a drum under velvet. He knew what this was: a platform in a trap, a chance in a narrowing. He could feel the house around him, the bus horn outside, the ledger on his desk, the petition spinning in opposite winds. He inhaled once, slow, and tapped reply, then stopped as a second email slid in beneath the first. This one from a sender he did not expect. Evelyn Cross E. Cross, everyreviewprep.edu. Subject: a word of advice. Before you go on air. The two emails sat one beneath the other, like competing roads. Interview request, National Morning Desk, and a word of advice. Before you go on air. Caleb read the subject lines twice, then opened the second one first. "Caleb," it began. "I hear you may be speaking to national media. Be cautious. Sound bites flatten complexity. Once you escalate, it will be difficult for the school to protect your scholarship prospects. Consider the implications for you and your family. If you'd like help shaping your message, I'm available. E. Cross." He stared at the screen. The sentences were soft-gloved and clean. No accusation, no threat. Just a reminder. The file. He heard Mr. Price in his head. Walls talk gently when they want to keep standing. He forwarded the email to himself, to Angela, to a folder he'd begun calling pressure. Then he opened the first note and typed, "Yes, available tomorrow. Conditions pre-recorded, no live split screen with teacher, and full question list in advance." It felt bold to ask, but he remembered Mr. Price's rule: if you're the story, you can set terms. He hit send and sat back, feeling the house around him, a bus horn fading down the block, a pot simmering on the stove, the hum of ordinary life stretching like a safety net under the day. The producer's reply came within minutes. "Agreed. Car at 5:30 a.m. 2 cameras. 20 minutes on tape. Thank you." Angela read Mrs. Cross's email, then the booking note. "You won't be alone," she said quietly. "We'll be behind the camera and Mr. Price can be on speaker beforehand. We'll edit your statement together tonight." Derek's voice was practical. "Eat first. Sleep some. Wear the gray sweater. It looks like you're here to learn, not to win." They worked at the kitchen table as if assembling something delicate. 3 sentences about why he'd chosen Bayard Rustin. 2 about coded language. 1 about the group chat without naming names. Angela cut adverbs like loose threads. Derek read each line out loud, testing how it sat in a mouth. Caleb practiced pausing, not for drama, for control. At 5:29, a black SUV idled at the curb. The driver carried a case that clicked when it opened, the equipment inside gleaming like instruments. They set up in the living room, pushing the coffee table aside. A small clip mic slid onto Caleb's collar. The producer, a woman with the calm, alert eyes of someone who had learned to hear what people didn't say, ran through the plan. "Take your time. If you want to redo, say from the top. We'll give you a transcript to verify quotes," she said. "We know you're a kid. We're not here to make you bleed." Caleb nodded. He could feel his hands trying to shake, so he set them gently on his knees. Angela and Derek took seats just out of frame, present but invisible, like scaffolding. The red light blinked on. Caleb, the interviewer began. Voice low, professional, kind. Why did you choose Baird Rustin? Caleb let the first breath leave his chest before he spoke. Because I was taught to look for who is doing the work, and who is allowed to be seen doing the work, he said. Rustin changed this country, but the story I learned in school kept him at the edges. I wanted to know why someone who built the stage was kept out of the spotlight. And what did you learn? She asked. That erasure isn't an accident. He said. It happens through choices, rules and language. Sometimes we call it standards. Sometimes we call it fit. But it all points in the same direction, away from certain people. The interviewer glanced at her notes. You've used the term coded language. What does that mean to you in a classroom? It's being told to stay in your lane when the lane is actually a wall, he said. It's getting marked down for being too emotional when you're quoting a case. It's jokes that sound harmless, but keep a story about you in the room before you get to speak. It's not usually a slur, it's a shrug. What do you want from your school? She asked. A place where we can say the true thing without being made smaller for it, he said. A place that treats my father's work like dignity, not a punchline. A place where objectivity doesn't mean pretending the water isn't wet. The interviewer looked up. You've received harassment since your presentation. How are you handling that? Caleb kept his tone steady. We're documenting it. We're not feeding it. I'm a student. I want to learn. That's not a scandal. The producer raised a hand. From the top of that line, she said gently. I'm a student, Caleb repeated. Cleaner now. I want to learn. That's not a scandal. They moved carefully through the next questions. He didn't say Mrs. Cross's name. He didn't generalize. He talked about patterns, about how subtle things add up, how an institution can behave like a person, kind to the camera, cold in the fire. When the interviewer asked, do you think this is about race? He breathed once and answered as if laying a stone. It's about who is expected to be grateful and quiet, he said. Race shapes that. So do class and what your parents do for a living. My dad drives the bus. That shouldn't decide how far I'm allowed to go in a discussion. They wrapped at 19 minutes. The producer unclipped the mic and squeezed his shoulder. You were clear, she said. Clarity travels. She promised to send a transcript within the hour, and the crew ghosted out as quietly as they'd arrived. When the segment aired at 8:12, Derek had already parked the bus for his mid-route break and sat in the depot with 3 other drivers, eyes fixed on the mounted TV. Angela stood in the living room, hands laced in front of her while Caleb hovered in the doorway like he might flee if his words betrayed him. The package was simple. Footage from the community meeting, a title card, student voice at Riverview Prep, and his interview intercut with B-roll of kids streaming into a school much like his, a country of brick and rules. Because I was taught to look for who is doing the work, and who is allowed to be seen doing the work. TV Caleb said, voice steadier than he felt. I want a school where objectivity doesn't mean pretending the water isn't wet. The line landed with a quiet thud in living rooms across the country. By 8:20, the segment had a clip on the show's social feed. By 8:45, teachers in 3 states had shared it with captions that read, "Listen to him." By 9:02, the first backlash reply called him ungrateful. By 9:10, a civil rights attorney quote-tweeted the clip with a thread about Baird Rustin and erasure. The debate unspooled in real time. Parents, teachers, alumni, pundits, trolls, and strangers who remembered the first time a classroom had told them to be less. At the bus depot, Derek said nothing as another driver elbowed him lightly. That your boy? The man asked, smiling. He sounds like he knows exactly where he's going. Derek took a slow sip of coffee and nodded. Pride sat in him like heat under steel. Beneath it, something colder, an instinct honed by years of routes, scanned the road ahead for black ice. At home, Angela's phone lit every few seconds. Your son is brave. Your son made me cry on the way to work. Your son is why we homeschool. She turned the volume off and left the phone face down. She watched Caleb instead. How he held himself. How he breathed. How he tried not to smile when his words sounded like the version he'd meant. When the transcript landed in his inbox, he read it aloud to them. No misquotes. No trap edits. The producer had kept her promise. Angela exhaled, a long ribbon of relief. Derek turned on the sink and ran water like a small benediction. Caleb leaned back in his chair and let his shoulders drop an inch. For a few minutes, they let the quiet be a place rather than a pause. By noon, the segment had crossed the line between a school story and a national one. A teachers' union page reposted it with a note about professional development and bias. An editorialist with 1 million followers wrote, "Coded language is the last mask." A conservative commentator asked, "Is school still school if every lesson is a grievance?" A poet replied, "If a room is flooded, and we say water, is that a grievance or a map?" Hashtags bloomed and tangled. A clip of Derek's bus pulling up to Riverview went small viral under the caption, "His dad drives him to a school that tried to drive him out." Caleb's inbox filled with invitations, podcasts, panels, student forums. He said no to almost all of them. Mr. Price texted a single line, "One voice, one channel, one clear point." Caleb wrote it on a sticky note and put it above his desk. Then the second wave hit, the one that pretends to be the first wave's better cousin. Polite op-eds, letters to the editor, well-constructed paragraphs with verbs like troubling and adjectives like unfortunate. The words didn't bristle, they enveloped, they asked for context, they asked for calm, they asked him to be precise, then punished precision with tone. Caleb didn't answer any of them. He spent the afternoon at the library, at the table where Mr. Price had first told him that walls sometimes feel like lanes. He answered 3 emails, one to the producer thanking her, one to the student journalist who had first asked the question about policy, and one to a 9th grader he didn't know who wrote, "I didn't know what to call it. Now I do." He told the 9th grader, "You don't need the perfect word to tell the true thing. Start with the thing." By late afternoon, the school released a statement on all channels. "We value student voice and teacher professionalism. We reject harassment. We are committed to a thorough investigation. We will not comment on personnel matters." It was a square, a frame, a fence. It held everything and nothing. The phone rang at 5:07 p.m. Unknown number. Caleb glanced at his parents. Angela nodded once. Derek's eyes met his, saying without saying, "Be exact." "Hello? Caleb Hunter?" "This is Superintendent Anders," the voice said, measured. Official. The kind of voice that could read a eulogy without trembling. "I'm calling as a courtesy." Caleb's spine straightened. "Yes, sir. I watched the segment," Anders said. "You were poised. You were clear. I appreciate that." "Thank you," Caleb said. Surprised to mean it. A breath on the line. Papers shifting. The sound of institutional air conditioning. However, Anders continued carefully. "I'm calling with an update about Mrs. Cross's status. There have been developments you should be aware of before they are public." Angela's eyes found Caleb's. Derek lowered himself into the chair across from him. Elbows on knees. Caleb kept his voice even. "What developments?" "We've received a demand letter from her counsel, and a procedural ruling that affects our ability to keep her on leave," Anders said, each syllable placed like a chess piece. "Effective immediately." He paused, as if measuring how much to say and how fast to say it. "Mrs. Cross will be returning to Riverview tomorrow morning." The news came without fanfare, slipped into inboxes and posted quietly on the school's announcements page. Following the conclusion of the independent investigation, Mrs. Evelyn Cross is no longer employed by Riverview Preparatory School. No adjectives, no explanations, just a sentence. Clean as a paper cut. Caleb read it twice before looking up. Angela stood by the counter with her phone in hand, reading the same words. Derek, home between routes, leaned against the doorway. No one smiled, not because they weren't relieved, but because they understood what it had taken to carve that sentence into the official record. "They didn't say why," Caleb noted. "They never do," Derek replied. "But the why is in the fact it's over." It wasn't just over for Mrs. Cross. A week later, Caleb was called into the principal's office. Principal Laraby's posture was as rigid as ever. But there was something else in his voice, an awareness that the room's power balance had shifted. "Caleb," he began, "on behalf of the scholarship committee, I want to congratulate you. You've been awarded a full academic scholarship for the remainder of your time at Riverview. This is based entirely on your record of excellence and your contributions to the school community." Caleb met his gaze. The words were crafted to make it clear, not pity, but they also carried a tacit acknowledgement. The file Mrs. Cross had once tried to hold over him was now empty of power. "Thank you," Caleb said, his tone even. Outside the office, the air felt different. Hallways that had once carried whispers about the bus driver's kid now carried something else: watchfulness, respect, even a little caution. Not everyone liked him, but fewer underestimated him. The months that followed were quiet, in a way that felt earned. Caleb kept his grades high, but his focus had widened. He joined a peer mediation group. He sat in on school board meetings. He wrote a column for the student paper, not about his own case, but about policy changes that made bias harder to hide. Mr. Price called these quiet tools. Not every fight needs to be loud, he said over tea one Saturday at the library. But every fight needs to leave something standing when you're done. Caleb thought about that every time a younger student lingered at his lunch table, clearly working up to a question. Sometimes they asked about study tips or clubs. Sometimes they asked about how to handle a teacher who joked too much. Caleb answered every question, never rushing them away. The official dismissal of Mrs. Cross traveled farther than Riverview's gates. A local education blog ran a piece titled "When Students Speak, Schools Must Listen." A larger outlet picked it up. There were debates online, some insisting she'd been cancelled, others pointing out that consequences aren't censorship. Caleb read a few, then stopped. He didn't need to track the echo anymore. One morning, as he walked into school, he passed the bulletin board near the entrance. A flyer for a student-led Equity Week was pinned there, with workshops on representation in curriculum and a panel on coded language. His name wasn't on it anywhere, but one of the organizers caught his eye and gave a small knowing nod. Caleb nodded back. At home, life settled into a rhythm that felt stronger at the seams. Derek still drove the morning and afternoon routes, but now other parents sometimes waved a little longer when they saw the Hunter bus. Angela still marked her papers at the kitchen table, but she also began mentoring first-year teachers in culturally responsive teaching. One evening, as they ate dinner, Derek said, "You know, I used to think resilience was about keeping your head down and getting through. But watching you, I think it's about keeping your head up so other people see it's possible." Caleb didn't answer right away. He thought of Baird Rustin, of the group chat meme, of Mrs. Cross's smirk, when she'd told him, "Let's see if you can make that relevant." Of the auditorium, when the voices began to multiply. "I think it's both," he said finally. "Sometimes you get through so you can get loud later." Spring came. The days lengthened. The air warmed, and Riverview's campus bloomed with the manicured neatness of a school brochure. Caleb found himself walking slower between classes, not from fatigue, but from a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he'd missed. It wasn't utopia. He still heard offhand comments in the halls, still caught the occasional sideways look from parents at pickup. But the difference was, he no longer absorbed them like truth. He let them pass, unclaimed. On the day his scholarship certificate was handed to him in a small private ceremony, he thought about the beginning, about that first morning when rain streaked the bus windows and Mrs. Cross had made her first joke. He thought about how small he'd felt then and how much space he'd learned to take now. Mr. Price was there, standing quietly in the back. When the short applause faded, he stepped forward. "You didn't just win, Caleb," he said. "You learned the map, and you left signs for the next person who needs it." Caleb smiled. "There'll always be another Mrs. Cross somewhere." "Yes," Mr. Price said, his eyes steady. "But now there's also you." That afternoon, Caleb walked home instead of taking the bus. The air was soft with the promise of summer. He passed the basketball courts where younger kids played in loose circles, their laughter skipping ahead of him. He was halfway down the block when he heard running footsteps behind him. A voice called out, high and urgent, "Caleb!" He turned to see a boy, maybe 12, maybe 13, panting as he caught up. His backpack was half-zipped, a notebook sticking out at an odd angle. His eyes were wide in a way Caleb recognized immediately. "They're saying things about me now," the boy blurted. "Can you help?" Caleb studied him for a moment, the way he stood waiting for an answer that might change everything. The street around them was quiet, except for the rustle of leaves. Caleb adjusted his backpack strap and said, "Yeah, let's talk." And together they started walking. If you believe no one should be silenced for speaking the truth, let your voice join theirs. Type yes if you believe in justice.